600 Portuguese soldiers, 22,000 enemy troops, 4 months of hell. You think you know fortress defense? You know nothing. February 3rd, 1509, Arabian Sea, a father wants blood. Dom Francisco de Almeida, first viceroy of Portuguese India, stands on the deck of Flor de Mar, watching Diu's harbor appear through the morning haze. 18 ships behind him, 1,500 Portuguese soldiers, 400 local fighters from Cochin. Against him, 200 vessels, the combined fleets of Gujarat, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, Calicut, backed by Ottoman guns and Venetian shipwrights. But Francisco doesn't care about the odds. His son is dead. March 1508, Chaul, 3 days of fighting. Lorenzo de Almeida commanded the Portuguese fleet when the Mamluks and Gujarat Admiral Malik Ayaz caught him by surprise. They isolated his ship, cut him down, never recovered the body. Back in Cochin, when the news reached Francisco, he locked himself in his quarters for 3 days. Refused to see anyone. When he emerged, he said one thing: he who ate the chick must also eat the rooster or pay for it. The Mamluks thought they'd won a great victory. Their commander Amir Hussein al-Kurdi, a Kurdish Mamluk, former governor of Jeddah, reported triumph back to Cairo. But the Mirat Sikandari, a contemporary Persian account from Gujarat, called it a minor skirmish. They took 9 Portuguese prisoners to Diu, left the dead in the water. That was their mistake. November 1505. The Mamluk expedition left Suez with 1,100 men. Orders from Sultan al-Ashraf Kansu al-Ghauri stopped the Portuguese. They fortified Jeddah first against Portuguese attack, quelled rebellions around Suakin and Mecca, then spent the monsoon season on Comorin Island, crossed to Aden at the Red Sea's tip. Got tangled in local politics with the Tahirid Emir, burned months, finally crossed the Indian Ocean, reached Diu in September 1507. A journey that should have taken 1 month took nearly 2 years. The fleet carried more than Egyptians, Turkish mercenaries, Ethiopian fighters, Venetian gunners. The Venetians provided the real edge. Mediterranean carracks and war galleys disassembled in Alexandria, carried overland, reassembled on the Red Sea. Why? Because Venice was bleeding money. Portuguese ships were bringing Indian spices around Africa's Cape. The old route through the Red Sea and Persian Gulf, controlled by Arabs and Venetians for centuries, was dying. Venice needed the Mamluks to win, but the Mamluks couldn't sail for shit. They specialized in mounted archery, land warriors. Their big vessels numbered maybe 12. The rest? Dhows, small, shallow draft fishing boats, too tiny for cannon. The Portuguese? State-of-the-art carracks and caravels built for ocean warfare, packed with guns. When it came to ship combat, Mamluks brought archers. Portuguese brought gunpowder and grenades. Gujarat's role was murky. Sultan of Gujarat supported the anti-Portuguese coalition, sure. Malik Ayaz, governor of Diu, a former slave of Georgian or Dalmatian origin, cunning as they come, turned Diu into Gujarat's main port, made it an essential link between Egypt and Malacca. Cloths and spices flowing east to west. But Ayaz read the room. When Hussein sailed into Diu with his fleet, Ayaz knew the Portuguese were coming. He couldn't reject Hussein without angering the Sultan of Gujarat or provoking Hussein's forces already in the city. Double bind. So he supported Hussein, but cautiously. Hedged his bets. December 6th, 1508. Afonso de Albuquerque arrived in Cananor from the Persian Gulf, carried orders from King Manuel of Portugal. Replace Almeida as viceroy. Francisco said no. Personal vendetta became rebellion against royal authority. He threw Albuquerque in jail, ruled Portuguese India as a rogue for another year. December 9th, the Portuguese fleet departed for Diu. First stop, Calicut. They hoped to intercept the Zamorans' fleet. Too late. Already at Diu, the Portuguese had 18 ships total, 5 large naus, including Flor do Mar, Francisco's flagship, captained by João de Nova, 4 smaller naus, 4 square-rigged caravels, 2 regular caravels, 2 galleys. Every captain knew the plan. Revenge. February 2nd, 1509. Portuguese sighted Diu from the crow's nests. Malik Ayaz withdrew from the city. Left overall command to Hussein. Hussein ordered ore ships to sally out and harass the Portuguese before they recovered from the journey. They didn't pass beyond range of the fortress cannon. Smart. Night fell. Muslim fleet retreated into the channel. Francisco summoned all captains. Decided the course of action. Dawn broke. Portuguese could see the enemy strategy. Muslims had lashed their carracks and galleys together close to shore, protected by Diu's fort with its artillery. Waiting for Portuguese attack, relinquishing initiative, classic defensive position, Francisco split his forces into 4 groups, 1 to board Mamluk carracks after bombardment, 1 to attack stationary galleys from the flank, a bombardment group to support the fleet. And João de Nova on Flor de Mar to block the channel entrance. The Portuguese found a local guide, 18 years old, knew the channel, dangerous, shallow, narrow. The boy promised to help in return for his release. They agreed. February 3rd, 1100 hours, incoming tide. Favorable winds. Francisco raised the royal banner atop Flor de Mar, fired a single shot, signal. Battle of Diu began. General cry of Santiago. Portuguese approached. Galley São Miguel led the formation, probing the channel. If you value documented naval history and fortress warfare like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the Wikipedia Battle of Diu article, updated June 14th, 2025, cross-referenced with the military archives from João de Barros, detailed Portuguese fleet composition published in Décadas de Ásia, and verified against Gaspar Correa's first-hand chronicles in Lendas de India. These are primary 16th century Portuguese sources documenting exact ship names, captain rosters, and battle sequences. Now back to the information. General bombardment between both forces. Within Diu's calm harbor waters, Portuguese employed innovative gunnery. Fired directly at the water. Cannonballs bounced like skipping stones. Multiplied impact. Devastated the anchored fleet. Hussein kept light ore ships back within the channel. Planned to attack Portuguese from behind when they engaged the carracks. João de Nova comprehended the stratagem. Maneuvered Flor de Mar to block the channel entrance. The compact mass of ore ships provided an ideal target. Portuguese gunners disabled many ships, blocked the path of ones following. Unable to break through, the Zamorans' boats turned around after short exchange, retreated to Calicut. Throughout the battle, Flor de Mar fired over 600 shots. Meanwhile, faster galleys and caravels grappled the flank of stationary enemy galleys. Enemy guns couldn't respond. Initial Portuguese assault repelled. Portuguese salvo set 3 galleys adrift. Then the boarding began. Santo Antonio ran through the fleet delivering Francisco's speech. Detailed reasons for seeking the enemy, rewards for victory, right to sack, knighthood to all soldiers, nobility to knights. Criminals banished from the realm would be pardoned. Slaves freed within a year would receive the condition of squires. Every man knew what was at stake. The wind turned. Portuguese closed. Hand-to-hand combat in Diu's harbor. Portuguese soldiers armed with firearms, grenades, swords, Mamluks with bows, arrows, scimitars. The technology gap was brutal. Portuguese gunpowder weapons tore through enemy crews. Ship after ship fell. By afternoon, the Alliance fleet was shattered. Every vessel sunk or captured except 6. But 1 ship remained, the largest vessel of the battle. Anchored too close to shore for deep draft Portuguese ships to reach. Reinforced hull resistant to cannon fire. Francisco ordered continuous bombardment from his entire fleet. Hours passed. The ship took hit after hit. Finally, just before nightfall, it sank. Movie-style ending to the Battle of Diu. Portuguese casualties, 32 dead, over 300 wounded. Enemy, projected 3,000 dead, even larger number of casualties unreported. The Mamluks fought bravely to the very end, but they were outgunned, outmaneuvered, outclassed. Malik Ayaz returned Portuguese prisoners from Chao, all well-dressed and fed, sent boats daily with lavish gifts, sheep, hens, eggs, oranges, lemons, cabbages, trying to appease Francisco. It didn't work. The treatment of Mamluk captives was brutal. Francisco ordered most hanged, burned alive, or torn to pieces, tied to cannon mouths. Retaliation for his son's death, no mercy. Hussein survived, managed to flee Diu with 22 other Mamluks on horseback, returned to Cairo several years later, charged with another fleet against the Portuguese. 3,000 men murdered on the Red Sea by his Turkish second-in-command, future Selman Reis of the Ottoman Navy. Francisco extracted payment from Diu's merchants, 300,000 gold zaraphans. They'd funded the Muslim fleet's refitting, paid the price. 100,000 distributed among troops, 10,000 donated to Cochin Hospital. Francisco refused to take over Diu, said it would be expensive to maintain, signed a trade agreement with Ayaz instead, opened a Faitoria, a trading post, left a garrison. The spoils? 3 galleys, 3 carracks, 600 bronze artillery pieces, 3 royal flags of the Mamluk Sultan of Cairo sent to Portugal, displayed in Convento de Cristo in Tomar, headquarters of the Order of Christ, former Knights Templar. Francisco was a member. The flags are still there today. Francisco's words after the battle became prophecy. As long as you may be powerful at sea, you will hold India as yours. And if you do not possess this power, little will avail you a fortress on the shore. Naval dominance. That was the lesson. November 1509. Francisco handed the viceroy post to Afonso de Albuquerque. finally released him from jail, left for Portugal. December the 1509, Francisco was killed. Skirmish with the Khoikhoi tribe near Cape of Good Hope. 70 other Portuguese died with him, more than died at Diu. Body buried on the beach. The man who secured Portuguese control of the Indian Ocean died on a foreign shore. Irony doesn't begin to cover it, but Diu wasn't finished. The Portuguese wanted that fortress. Tried to take it by force in 1521. Failed. Tried again in 1531 under Governor Nuno de Cunha. 100 vessels, 8,000 men including 3,000 Portuguese. Bombed Diu. No foothold. Failed again. Then opportunity knocked. 1535, Sultan Bahadur Shah of Gujarat faced a problem. Mughal Emperor Humayun was coming for him. Ready to annex Gujarat, Bahadur needed help. He turned to the Portuguese. Made a deal. Treaty of Bassein, 1534. Portuguese could build a fortress at Diu in exchange for assistance against the Mughals. Protection if the realm fell. Portuguese seized Gogala stronghold near the city. Built Diu Fort, massive. One of the most harmonious and majestic fortresses Portugal ever constructed. Started 1535, kept strengthening it through 1546. Captain Antonio da Silveira, experienced fighter, former captain of Bassein and Hormuz, veteran of the Portuguese-Gujarati War of 1531 to 34, took command. The fortress housed 3,000 people, 600 soldiers. Once Humayun's threat receded, Bahadur tried to negotiate Portuguese withdrawal. February 13th, 1537, Bahadur drowned during negotiations on a Portuguese ship. Unclear circumstances, both sides blamed each other. Convenient death for Portugal. Suspicious death for Gujarat. Bahadur had also appealed to the Ottomans. Expel the Portuguese? Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent heard the call. 1538, time to settle scores. The Ottoman governor of Egypt, Hadim Suleiman Pasha, 60-year-old eunuch, nominated to lead the expedition. Started organizing in 1536 when Bahadur's envoy arrived with large tribute. Built a fleet. The Tariq al-Shihri records 80 vessels, 40,000 men. Gaspar Correa provides more detail. 15 bastard galleys, 40 royal galleys, 6 galleots, 5 galleons with 4 masts each, dangerous ships, shallow with no keel, 5 smaller craft, 6 foists from Gujarat, 2 brigs, over 400 artillery pieces total, over 10,000 sailors and rowers including 1,500 Christians, 6,000 soldiers, 1,500 of them Janissaries, elite Ottoman infantry. Pasha employed a Venetian renegade, Francisco as captain of 10 galleys, 800 Christian mercenaries, largest Ottoman fleet ever sent to the Indian Ocean, July 20th, 1538. Armada set sail from Jeddah, stopped at Comorin Island, proceeded to Aden. At Aden, Pasha Suleiman captured the city by inviting its ruler, Sheikh Amir bin Dawood, favorable to the Portuguese, aboard his ships, then hanging him. Aden occupied without siege, plundered. August 19th. Expedition left Aden, called at Socotra, made way to western Gujarat coast, lost some ships that got separated during the Indian Ocean passage, but the bulk arrived. June 26th, 1538, Gujarati forces under Qajar Safar began. Qajar Safar, insane. Koji Sofar in Portuguese, Albanian renegade from Otranto, influential lord in Gujarat, commanded 16,000 Gujarati troops. They crossed the channel of Diu onto the western island. City's western walls held them back just long enough. Portuguese filled water reserves. Burned supply storages in the city, retreated to the fortress on the eastern end. 2 months, Gujaratis unable to threaten the besieged with more than low-intensity bombardment. Portuguese conducted occasional raids on Gujarati positions. August 14th, Lopo de Sousa Coutinho, who'd later write his memoirs, distinguished himself. Led 14 Portuguese in a sortie into the city to capture supplies. Defeated 400 soldiers of Qajar Safar. September 4th, 1538. Ottoman fleet arrived. Caught Portuguese garrison by surprise. Blockaded fortress by sea. Antonio da Silveira immediately sent a small craft to run the blockade. Distress call to Goa. Pasha Suleiman promptly landed 500 Janissaries. They plundered the city. Caused Suleiman to fall out of favor with Gujarat lords except Qajar Safar. Janissaries attempted to scale fortress walls, repelled with 50 dead. September 7th, strong storm fell upon Diu, damaged part of Ottoman fleet, helped Portuguese restore water supplies. Turks began unloading artillery, further 1,000 men. Raising defensive and siege works around the fort. Gujarati lords became distrustful, feared Ottomans might establish themselves in Diu after expelling Portuguese. September 8th, refused to provide further supplies. September 10th, Gujarati army bombarded the Portuguese redoubt across the Diu Channel. Villa dos Rooms, village of the Turks, modern-day Gogola, Captain Francisco Pacheco commanded, defended by 30 to 40 Portuguese. Qajar Safar, assaulted with Turkish artillery and janissaries, repelled. Qajar then ordered a craft filled with timber, sulfur, and tar, hoped to smoke the Portuguese out. Antonio da Silveira saw the plan, sent Francisco de Gouveia with a small crew on a craft to burn the device with firebombs under cover of night. September 28th. Ottoman artillery opened fire on the fortress. Galleys bombarded from sea. Portuguese replied, sank a galley. Lost several men when 2 basilisks exploded. October 1st. Portuguese garrison at Villa dos Rooms couldn't hold. Captain Pacheco agreed to surrender to the Pasha, granted safe passage to fortress unharmed. When they surrendered, Suleiman imprisoned them on his galleys. Treachery. Under Pasha's power, Pacheco wrote a letter to Antonio da Silveira, advised him to lay down arms, delivered by Portuguese renegade Antonio Faleiro, who'd converted to Islam, dressed in Turkish fashion. At first unrecognizable by his former comrades, Antonio da Silveira's reply became legend. For such a great and powerful captain as you claim he is, he ought to better keep his charters, and yet I'm not as surprised by his lack of truth, which they are born with, as by your writing. Be well advised, tell him to do as much as he can, for over the smallest stone of this fortress we shall all perish. Be warned not to bring me nor send me more of such messages, for as enemies I shall have the bombards fire upon you. Gaspar Correa provided a different account, but Lopo de Souza Coutinho, veteran who personally participated, told it straight, and his version includes the real response. I've seen the words in your letter, and that of the captain, which you have imprisoned through lie and betrayal of your word, signed under your name, which you have done because you are no man, for you have no balls, you are like a lying woman and a fool. How do you intend to pact with me? If you committed betrayal and falsity right before my eyes, be assured that here are Portuguese accustomed to killing many Moors, and they have as captain Antonio da Silveira, who has a pair of balls stronger than the cannonballs of your basilisks, that there's no reason to fear someone who has no balls, no honor and lies. October 5th, Turks finished siege works, assembled all artillery, 9 basilisks, 5 great bombards, 15 heavy guns, 40 smaller pieces, 130 cannons total bombarding the fortress. October 31st, final Ottoman assault. Pasha Suleiman attempted diversion, faked withdrawal, embarked 1,000 men. Antonio da Silveira, ever cautious, ordered sentries alert. Daybreak, 14,000 men divided in 3 banners attempted to scale the fortress, bombarded with no regard to friendly fire. A few hundred troops managed to scale walls, raised banners. Portuguese repelled them, killed 500, wounded further 1,000 from gunfire and bombs out of São Tomé Bastion. Pasha's relationship with Qajar Safar degrading, increasingly fearful of being caught by the Viceroy's armada. November 1st, Pasha finally decided to abandon the siege, began re-embarking troops. November 5th morning, fleet of 24 small galleys sighted. Believing it, the vanguard of the governor's rescue fleet, Pasha hurriedly departed, left 1,200 dead, 500 wounded behind. Qajar Safar set fire to his encampment, abandoned the island shortly after. Reality? Just a forward fleet under Antonio da Silva Meneses and Dom Luis de Ataide, dispatched from Goa with reinforcements. Supplies, news that the governor would depart soon. They took no part in fighting. Triumphantly received within the ruined fortress by last survivors, Portuguese by then critically low on gunpowder and supplies. Less than 40 valid men. Final stages of siege, even women assisted defense. Catarina Lopez and Isabel Madeira, 2 female captains who actively participated, led squads of female soldiers. The craft Antonio sent arrived in Goa mid-September. Governor Nuno da Cunha already knew about the Turks. Portuguese had intercepted a Turkish galleon in southern India. Another galley that got separated from the fleet called at Honavar. Portuguese destroyed it with local aid, fight in which Fernão Mendes Pinto participated. Viceroy remained in Goa 2 more months, organizing forces, gathered an imposing fleet. According to João de Barros, 170 sail, 4,500 Portuguese soldiers. According to Francisco de Andrade's detailed report, 152 vessels, 9 heavy carracks, 14 galleons, 13 small carracks, 8 war caravels, 5 Latin caravels, 1 bastard galley, 13 royal galleys, 15 galleots, 11 Mediterranean brigantines, 2 albatokas, 18 light galleys, 44 light vessels and oarcraft, bearing 5,000 Portuguese soldiers, 3,000 Indian auxiliaries, 1,500 Portuguese sailors, uncounted native sailors, oarsmen, combat slaves, little under 400 heavy cannon, 600 light cannon. Just as expedition was about to set sail, craft arrived in Goa. Siege had been lifted. Relief turned to celebration, but the damage was done. The siege was over. But victory smelled like death. Nuno da Cunha's Grand Armada arrived at Diu to find a charnel house. The fortress walls were rubble, the bastions heaps of shattered stone. Of the original 600 defenders, less than 40 men were fit to stand, ghosts haunting their own triumph. The women, Caterina Lopes and Isabel Madeira among them, who had held the lines when the men fell, looked out from the ruins, their faces smeared with gunpowder and grief. They had held the line. They had paid the price. But this was not an ending. It was an intermission. The forces that had converged on this tiny island, Gujarati ambition, Ottoman power, Portuguese desperation, had not vanished. They had merely recoiled, waiting for the next round. In Goa, the news of the victory was met with jubilation, then with a sobering reality check. Nuno da Cunha, the governor who had hesitated, who had spent months assembling a fleet that arrived after the battle was won, was replaced. Dom Garcia de Noronha took his place, but he died in office. Then came Dom Estevão da Gama, son of the legendary Vasco da Gama, the weight of a name. He sailed a fleet into the Red Sea in 1541, a direct challenge to the Ottomans in their home waters, burning ships at Suez. It was a show of force, a message that Portugal would not be contained to India. But it was a raid, not an occupation. The real prize remained Diu. The fortress was rebuilt, not just repaired, but redesigned for a new era of warfare. The lessons of 1538 were written in stone and mortar. The bastions were thickened, the firing angles were perfected, new outworks were constructed, creating a layered defense designed to bleed an attacker for every inch of ground. Diu was no longer just a fort, it was a machine for killing, the most advanced piece of military engineering in the East. It had to be, because its enemies were learning, too. The man who had orchestrated the first siege, Qajar Safar, the Albanian renegade the Portuguese called Koja Sofar, had not forgotten. He had watched the Ottoman fleet sail away in disgrace. He had watched his own Gujarati forces abandon the field. Humiliation burned hotter than any cannon. He retreated to the court of Sultan Mahmud III of Gujarat, a young and weak ruler. There, he plotted. He knew the Ottomans had been a blunt instrument, powerful but clumsy. The next time, he would be in command. The next time, there would be no mistakes. Over the next 8 years, Koja Sofar consolidated his power. He became the Sultan's chief minister, the whisper in his ear, the true power behind the throne. He played the court politics of Gujarat with masterful skill, eliminating rivals, placing his own men in positions of authority. And all the while, he rebuilt his army. He stockpiled cannons, many of them cast by European renegades. He trained his men in siege tactics. He sent letters to Constantinople, not begging for a massive fleet this time, but for elite troops, janissaries, artillery experts, engineers. He did not need an armada. He needed specialists. He needed killers. In 1545, the final piece of his plan fell into place. He convinced Sultan Mahmud to move his court to Diu, ostensibly to oversee the final expulsion of the Portuguese. The real reason was simpler. With the Sultan under his direct control, Koja Sofar could act with impunity. But the Sultan was beginning to see the truth. He saw that his chief minister was becoming a king. He made a fatal mistake. He tried to have Koja Sofar assassinated. The plot failed. Koja Sofar Austiru, now openly defiant, had the Sultan himself murdered in his own camp. With the Sultan dead, Koja Sofar was the undisputed master of Gujarat. He had an army of 20,000 men, he had 130 cannons, and he had a singular obsession, the Fortress of Diu. Inside that fortress, a new commander had taken charge. Dom Juan de Mascarenhas. He was young, barely 30 years old, but he was a veteran of the endless wars in the East. He had around 800 Portuguese soldiers under his command, along with a few hundred local auxiliaries and slaves. He looked at his walls, the strongest in the Portuguese Empire. He looked at his cannons, polished and ready. He knew Koja Sofar was coming. What he did not know was the hell that was about to be unleashed upon him. In April of 1546, it began. The second siege of Diu. Koja Sofar's army crossed the channel and swarmed the island. They did not bother with the city this time. They went straight for the fortress. The bombardment started on April 20th. It was not like the siege of 1538. This was a scientific, methodical destruction. Koja Sofar's European engineers directed the fire, concentrating on a single point, the bastion of São Tomé. Day after day, for 20 straight days, the cannons roared. The stone walls, which had seemed invincible, began to crack, to crumble, to fall away in great clouds of dust. Portuguese gunners fought back, but they were outgunned 10-1. Dom Juan de Mascarenhas watched his fortress being dismantled before his eyes. He sent out raiding parties, desperate sorties to disrupt the enemy's siege lines. They inflicted casualties, but were always driven back. The Gujaratis were too numerous, their lines too well fortified. On May 11th, the São Tomé bastion was a ruin. The Gujarati forces charged. The Portuguese met them in the breach. A nightmare of hand-to-hand combat amidst the rubble. For hours, they fought with swords, pikes, and grenades. The attackers were thrown back, but the cost was immense. Khoja Sofar changed tactics. He had seen that a direct assault, even through a breach, was too costly. He would go under the walls. He brought in his sappers, his miners. The war moved underground. This was a new kind of terror. The defenders could hear it day and night. The faint, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of picks against rock from deep beneath their feet. They did not know where the enemy was, only that they were coming. The Portuguese began to dig countermines, desperate tunnels to intercept the attackers in the dark. The fighting that followed was the stuff of nightmares, men meeting in cramped, airless tunnels, fighting with knives and daggers in total blackness, the earth threatening to collapse and bury them all. On June 27th, the sound of digging beneath the bastion of São João stopped. The defenders knew what it meant. They evacuated the bastion, pulling every man back. Moments later, the world exploded. A massive mine detonated, charged with an enormous quantity of gunpowder. The entire bastion of São João, a structure of stone and earth that had taken years to build, was lifted into the air and then collapsed into a crater of fire and smoke. More than 60 Portuguese soldiers died in an instant, among them one of the most experienced captains, Francisco de Gouveia. The explosion was so powerful it was felt for miles. Khoja Sofar had his breach, a massive smoking hole in the fortress's main line of defense. He threw his army forward. The few surviving Portuguese defenders, led by Mascarenhas himself, raced to plug the gap. What followed was one of the most desperate battles of the entire siege. The Portuguese were impossibly outnumbered, fighting on the edge of a crater filled with the bodies of their comrades. They held, by some miracle of courage and desperation, they held the line. The Gujarati assault faltered, broke, and retreated, leaving hundreds of dead in the ruins of the bastion. But the war of mines was not over. Khoja Sofar was relentless. He ordered new tunnels dug, this time towards the São Tomé bastion. Again, the defenders heard the digging. Again, they dug countermines. On August 10th, the Portuguese miners broke through into an enemy gallery. In the subterranean darkness, they fought a desperate battle, but the Gujaratis were prepared. They detonated a smaller mine inside the tunnel. The explosion collapsed the Portuguese countermine, burying the miners alive. That same day, above ground, a stray Portuguese cannonball found its mark. Khoja Sofar was inspecting his siege lines when the shot came in. It struck him down, killing him instantly. The man who had dreamed of this revenge for 8 years lay dead in the dust. For a moment, the Portuguese thought it was over. They thought the death of the leader would break the army. They were wrong. Khoja Sofar's son, Rumi Khan the Younger, a man who hated the Portuguese with a passion equal to his father's, immediately took command. The siege would continue. By now, the fortress was a ruin. The original 800 Portuguese defenders were down to less than 200. They were starving. Disease was rampant. Gunpowder was running dangerously low. The walls were breached in a dozen places. Every day, the survivors looked out to sea, praying for the sight of sails, praying for Goa to save them. In Goa, the man who had to save them was facing his own battles. The new viceroy was Dom Juan de Castro. He was not like the other governors. He was a scientist, a humanist, a cartographer who had mapped the Red Sea with unparalleled precision. He was also a brilliant and ruthless commander. When the first desperate messages from Diu reached him, he knew the situation was critical, but he faced a problem. The treasury was empty. The political council in Goa was hesitant, arguing that sending a fleet would leave Goa itself defenseless. Castro argued, he pleaded, he raged. He told them that if Diu fell, all of Portuguese India would fall. To raise money for the fleet, he did something that became legend. He sent a lock of his own beard to the city of Goa as a pledge for a loan. This was no small gesture. In the 16th century, a man's beard was the symbol of his honor. To pawn it was to pawn his very soul. The city was so moved by this act that they opened their coffers. But it still was not enough. Castro then asked his son, Dom Fernão, for the bones of his own grandfather, buried in a chapel in Goa. He intended to pawn the relics. The outcry was so great that the money was finally raised without this desecration. Slowly, painstakingly, the relief fleet was assembled. In late August, Castro was able to send a small advance force of about 400 men under the command of his son, Dom Álvaro de Castro. They fought their way through the blockade and into Diu's harbor. The sight of their sails was like a resurrection for the defenders. The reinforcements brought supplies, gunpowder, and most importantly, hope. But they were not enough to break the siege. They were just enough to prolong the agony. Back in Goa, Dom Juan de Castro was ready. On October 31st, 1546, he set sail with the main fleet, 160 ships, 4,000 Portuguese soldiers, an army of Indian auxiliaries. This was not a relief force. This was an army of liberation. He arrived off the coast of Diu on November 7th. The 7-month siege was about to reach its climax. Castro did not simply sail into the harbor. He was a strategist. He landed his forces at night, on the opposite side of the island, undetected by the Gujarati army. His plan was audacious. He would attack the besiegers from the rear, catching them in a pincer between his army and the defenders of the fort. On November 10th, 1546, the final battle began. Castro divided his army into 3 columns. He gave a speech that was recorded by the chroniclers, a fiery call to arms invoking God, King, and the honor of Portugal. He reminded them of the defenders inside the fortress, their brothers who had endured 7 months of hell. Then he gave the order to advance. The Gujarati army, caught completely by surprise, was thrown into chaos. They had been focused on the fortress for so long they had forgotten about the world behind them. Rumi Khan tried to rally his men to turn his siege lines into a battle line. It was too late. The Portuguese crashed into their flank like a tidal wave. At the same time, the gates of the Fortress of Diu burst open. Dom Juan de Mascarenhas, with the last 200 survivors of the siege, charged out. They were skeletal figures, more ghosts than men, but they fought with the fury of the damned. They crashed into the other side of the Gujarati army. The battle was a slaughter. The Gujarati army, 20,000 strong, caught between 2 attacking forces, completely disintegrated. They broke and ran, throwing down their weapons. Rumi Khan was killed. Thousands were cut down as they tried to flee across the channel to the mainland. By the end of the day, the ground outside the fortress was covered with the dead. The Portuguese had lost about 100 men. The Gujarati army had lost over 5,000, with thousands more wounded or captured. All 130 of their cannons were taken. The second siege of Diu was over. Dom Juan de Castro walked through the gates of the fortress he had just saved. What he saw horrified him. The place was a ruin, a skeleton of a fortress. The survivors were emaciated, covered in wounds and sores. They had endured for 214 days. They had faced constant bombardment, starvation, disease, and the terror of the underground war. They had seen their walls blown up from under them, and they had not surrendered. Castro ordered the fortress to be rebuilt immediately, stronger than ever. He returned to Goa a hero. The city gave him a Roman-style triumph, a parade through the streets with captured banners and cannons, with Castro himself crowned with a laurel wreath. It was the highest honor a Portuguese commander had ever received in the East. He had saved Diu. He had shattered the power of Gujarat for a generation, and he had sent a clear message to the Ottoman Empire. The Indian Ocean belonged to Portugal, but the triumph was short-lived. The endless wars and the strain of command had taken their toll. Just 2 years later, in 1548, Dom Juan de Castro, the scientist, the humanist, the savior of Diu, died in Goa in the arms of his friend, the missionary Francis Xavier. He died poor, having spent his entire fortune in service to the crown. The Fortress of Diu still stands today. Its walls bear the scars of cannonballs from sieges fought 5 centuries ago. They are a monument to a forgotten age of empires, an age of unimaginable violence and unbelievable courage. The names of the great captains are remembered: Antonio da Silveira, Dom Juan de Mascarenhas, Dom Juan de Castro. But the fortress was held by hundreds of nameless soldiers, sailors, and civilians who refused to break. They held the line against impossible odds. Not once, but twice. They paid for an empire with their blood. In the dust and fire of a tiny island fortress halfway across the world. You think you know what it means to hold the line. You have no idea